The 1970s should have been the golden age of anti-war cinema, but Hollywood had other plans. While studios were busy making sanitized Vietnam movies, some of the most powerful war films ever made were being buried, banned, or straight up sabotaged by the industry itself. Did you know one film was so controversial that the director mortgaged his house just to get it made, only to watch studios try to destroy his career? These aren't just forgotten gems. They're critically acclaimed masterpieces that Hollywood actively tried to erase because they told uncomfortable truths about war, politics, and American imperialism. 15. Go Tell the Spartans, 1978. Burt Lancaster delivers one of his finest late-career performances in this Vietnam War film that predicted America's defeat 4 years before Saigon fell. Set in 1964, the film follows a weary army major assigned to defend a remote outpost that everyone knows is strategically worthless. What makes this film remarkable isn't just Lancaster's nuanced portrayal of military pragmatism, but the fact that it was made while the Vietnam War was still a fresh wound for American audiences. Director Ted Post, known for Magnum Force, brought documentary-style realism to create something unprecedented. A Vietnam movie that wasn't about heroism or trauma, but about institutional stupidity. The film's prescient script, based on Daniel Ford's novel Incident at Moose Jaw, anticipated the fall of Saigon with uncanny accuracy, showing how American advisors were fighting an unwinnable war against an enemy they didn't understand. Critics praised the film's authenticity and Lancaster's restrained performance, but audiences stayed away in droves. The film earned only $1.2 million at the box office, partly because distributors were reluctant to promote a film that questioned American military strategy while veterans were still returning home. The film's most powerful moment comes when Lancaster's character realizes that his men are dying for a piece of ground that will be abandoned the moment they leave. Modern viewers recognize Go Tell the Spartans as one of the most honest Vietnam films ever made, free from the psychological melodrama that would dominate later war movies. The film's influence on Platoon and Born on the 4th of July is clear, but it took decades for critics to recognize its pioneering approach to depicting military futility. 14. Cross of Iron, 1977. Sam Peckinpah's final masterpiece follows German soldiers on the Eastern Front in this brutal examination of military honor versus survival. James Coburn stars as Sergeant Steiner, a decorated NCO who refuses to play politics, while his aristocratic officer, Maximilian Schell, schemes for personal glory. What makes this film extraordinary is Peckinpah's decision to humanize German soldiers without sanitizing Nazi ideology, creating moral complexity that Hollywood found deeply uncomfortable. The film's $6 million budget allowed for spectacular action sequences, but Peckinpah's real achievement was showing how war corrupts everyone it touches, regardless of which side they're fighting for. Critics initially struggled with a film that portrayed Wehrmacht soldiers sympathetically, while American audiences were still processing Vietnam. The film's graphic violence and anti-heroic tone alienated distributors who expected either traditional war heroics or clear anti-Nazi messaging. Box office was disappointing at $4.2 million domestic, leading many to write off Peckinpah's career as finished. The film's most controversial element was its refusal to provide easy moral answers. Steiner is neither hero nor villain, just a professional soldier trying to survive institutional madness. Peckinpah's trademark slow-motion violence reaches its peak in the film's final battle, where the distinction between courage and insanity becomes meaningless. The film's influence on later war movies, particularly Das Boot and Saving Private Ryan, is immeasurable. Modern audiences can appreciate Cross of Iron as Peckinpah's most mature work, combining his fascination with violence with genuine insight into military culture and the corrupting nature of institutional power. 13. The Boys and Company C, 1978. This raw Vietnam drama beat Platoon to theaters by 8 years, but was buried by distributors who thought audiences weren't ready for honest depictions of American soldiers. Stan Shaw and Andrew Stevens lead an ensemble cast as Marine recruits who discover that survival requires abandoning everything they were taught about honor and duty. Director Sidney J. Furie, fresh off Superman, brought gritty realism to create something unprecedented. A Vietnam movie that showed American soldiers as neither heroes nor victims, but as young men corrupted by an impossible situation. The film's $3 million budget forced creative solutions that actually enhanced its authenticity, with shooting locations in the Philippines providing convincing jungle warfare. Critics praised the film's unflinching honesty and ensemble acting, but distributors struggled to market a war movie that offered no clear heroes or redemptive message. The film's most shocking sequence involves American soldiers murdering their own officer, based on documented incidents that military censors tried to suppress. Box office was modest at $2.8 million, partly because theater chains were reluctant to book a film that portrayed the military so negatively. The film's influence on later Vietnam movies is clear, but it took Oliver Stone's Platoon to make similar themes commercially acceptable. Fury's direction captures the disorienting nature of guerrilla warfare, where enemies are invisible and every civilian might be a threat. Modern viewers can appreciate how The Boys in Company C anticipated every major theme that would dominate Vietnam cinema for the next 2 decades, from the breakdown of military discipline to the moral corruption of young soldiers. 12th, Hearts and Minds, 1974. Peter Davis's documentary masterpiece exposed the lies and propaganda that fueled the Vietnam War, earning an Oscar while being banned from military bases worldwide. Using archival footage and interviews with both American officials and Vietnamese civilians, the film creates a devastating critique of American foreign policy that remains relevant today. What makes this documentary extraordinary is Davis's decision to let subjects condemn themselves through their own words, particularly a horrifying sequence where a general dismisses Vietnamese casualties because Orientals don't value life the way we do. The film's $1.2 million budget came from independent sources after every major studio rejected the project as unpatriotic and potentially damaging to America's international reputation. The documentary's most powerful sequence shows Vietnamese funeral footage intercut with American officials discussing acceptable losses, creating a moral contrast that left audiences stunned. Military officials pressured theater chains to refuse bookings, leading to limited distribution despite critical acclaim and Oscar recognition. The film's influence on later documentaries and narrative features dealing with American imperialism cannot be overstated. Davis's technique of contrasting official statements with visual evidence became the standard for investigative documentary filmmaking. The film was banned from military installations and many college campuses, leading to underground screenings that only increased its reputation. Modern audiences recognize Hearts and Minds as one of the most important political documentaries ever made, but its distribution was severely limited by government pressure and industry blacklisting. The film's Oscar win in 1975 marked a rare victory for politically charged documentaries, but it took decades for the film to receive widespread recognition. 11. Little Big Man, 1970. Arthur Penn's revisionist Western uses Custer's last stand to comment on Vietnam, creating one of the most politically charged films of the decade, while being marketed as harmless entertainment. Dustin Hoffman plays a 121-year-old man recounting his experiences with both white settlers and Native Americans, creating a narrative that systematically dismantles every myth about American expansion. What makes this film subversive is Penn's decision to show the Indian Wars as genocide, while drawing explicit parallels to contemporary events in Southeast Asia. The film's $15 million budget allowed for spectacular battle sequences, but Penn's real achievement was creating an epic that questions the very foundations of American heroic mythology. Critics recognized the film's political subtext, but distributors marketed it as a quirky comedy adventure to avoid controversy during a polarized political period. The film's most powerful sequence depicts the Washita River Massacre, filmed with documentary realism that makes the parallels to My Lai unmistakable. Box office was strong at $31.5 million, proving that audiences would accept anti-war messages if they were packaged as historical entertainment. The film's influence on later revisionist westerns, particularly Dances with Wolves and Unforgiven, is clear. Penn's direction creates an epic that's simultaneously entertaining and politically devastating, using humor and spectacle to deliver messages that would have been rejected in a straight drama. The film's portrayal of Native Americans as complex human beings rather than noble savages or primitive enemies was revolutionary for its time. Modern audiences can appreciate how Little Big Man anticipated later discussions about American imperialism and the mythology of manifest destiny. 10th Soldier Blue, 1970. Ralph Nelson's shocking Western depicted cavalry massacres with such graphic realism that it was banned in several countries and heavily censored in the United States. Candice Bergen and Peter Strauss star as survivors of an Indian attack who witnessed the systematic slaughter of a Cheyenne village by U.S. cavalry. What makes this film notorious is Nelson's decision to show genocidal violence with unflinching honesty, creating images so disturbing that they were compared to concentration camp footage. The film's $4 million budget allowed for extensive location shooting, but the graphic violence overshadowed everything else and led to widespread censorship. Critics were divided between those who praised the film's honesty about American history and those who condemned it as exploitative violence masquerading as social commentary. The film's final massacre sequence was cut or banned in numerous countries, leading to multiple versions with varying degrees of censorship. Box office was strong initially due to controversy, but theater chains began dropping the film after complaints from veterans groups and government officials. The film's influence on later depictions of frontier violence is clear, but its graphic content prevented widespread distribution for decades. Nelson's direction creates an uncompromising vision of American expansion that refuses to provide comfort or redemption for viewers. The film's portrayal of cavalry soldiers as war criminals rather than heroes was unprecedented in American cinema. Modern audiences can appreciate Soldier Blue as an early example of films that used historical settings to comment on contemporary conflicts, particularly the ongoing violence in Vietnam. The film's reputation as one of the most violent westerns ever made overshadowed its political message for decades. 9. Coming Home, 1978. Hal Ashby's intimate drama about Vietnam, veterans returning to an America that doesn't want them, earned Jane Fonda an Oscar while being quietly buried by studio executives who feared its anti-war message. Jon Voight and Bruce Dern deliver powerhouse performances as a paralyzed veteran and a Marine officer whose lives intersect through Fonda's character, creating a love triangle that explores the physical and psychological costs of war. What makes this film remarkable is Ashby's decision to focus on the war's aftermath rather than combat, showing how conflict destroys families and communities long after the shooting stops. The film's $3 million budget forced creative solutions that enhanced its intimacy, with much of the action taking place in hospital corridors and suburban bedrooms rather than exotic locations. Critics universally praise the film's emotional honesty in the performances, particularly Voight's portrayal of a bitter veteran discovering purpose through political activism. The film's most controversial element was its frank discussion of sexual dysfunction among wounded veterans, a topic that military officials wanted kept out of public discourse. United Artists initially supported the project, but grew nervous as Jane Fonda's anti-war activism made her a polarizing figure during the film's production. Box office was modest at $32.7 million despite Oscar wins, partly because conservative audiences boycotted anything associated with Fonda's political positions. The film's influence on later veteran-focused dramas, particularly Born on the 4th of July, is clear. Ashby's direction creates an intimate epic that personalizes political issues without resorting to melodrama or propaganda. Modern audiences recognize Coming Home as one of the most honest portrayals of veteran experiences ever filmed, but its association with controversial political figures limited its initial impact. 8. The Deer Hunter, 1978. Michael Cimino's epic meditation on Vietnam's impact on working-class America became one of the most controversial films of the decade, earning Oscars while being accused of racism and historical distortion. Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, and John Savage play Pennsylvania steelworkers whose lives are destroyed by their experiences as prisoners of war. What makes this film controversial is Cimino's decision to focus on American suffering while largely ignoring Vietnamese perspectives, creating a narrative that some critics viewed as racist propaganda disguised as anti-war cinema. The film's $15 million budget allowed for spectacular set pieces, particularly the Russian roulette sequences that became iconic while being criticized as historically inaccurate. Critics were sharply divided, with some hailing it as a masterpiece and others condemning it as a reactionary fantasy that blamed America's Vietnam defeat on enemy cruelty rather than failed policy. The film's 3-hour runtime and graphic violence made it a difficult sell to mainstream audiences, but word of mouth and critical support led to box office success. The Russian roulette scenes were denounced by Vietnamese American groups and historians who pointed out that such practices were never documented during the war. The film's portrayal of Vietnamese characters as sadistic torturers, while depicting Americans as noble victims, sparked protests and boycotts in several cities. Cimino's direction creates an epic that's simultaneously deeply moving and morally questionable, using spectacular filmmaking to support a narrative that many viewers found problematic. The film's influence on later Vietnam movies is immeasurable, but its political implications remain controversial 4 decades later. Modern audiences struggle with a film that combines undeniable artistic achievement with questionable racial politics and historical revisionism. 7. Paths of Glory, 1957/1970s revival. Stanley Kubrick's World War I masterpiece was banned in France until 1975 and faced constant censorship attempts when it gained new relevance during the Vietnam era. Kirk Douglas stars as a French colonel who defends 3 soldiers accused of cowardice after a suicidal attack fails. While the film was made in 1957, it found its most appreciative audience during the 1970s anti-war movement, when its themes of military incompetence and institutional injustice resonated with Vietnam-era audiences. What makes this film extraordinary is Kubrick's clinical dissection of military hierarchy, showing how officers use enlisted men as expendable resources while protecting their own careers. The film's relatively modest budget of $935,000 was stretched through creative cinematography that makes the trenches feel authentically claustrophobic. French authorities banned the film for 18 years, considering it an insult to military honor and national dignity. When the film was finally released in France in 1975, it sparked renewed controversy and protests from veterans groups. Critics universally praised Kubrick's direction and Douglas's performance, but distributors struggled with a film that offered no heroic characters or redemptive message. The film's courtroom sequence remains one of cinema's most devastating critiques of military justice, showing how legal proceedings become elaborate theater designed to protect institutional authority. Kubrick's influence on later anti-war films is immeasurable, but Paths of Glory was considered too radical for mainstream audiences during its initial release. The film's 1970s revival introduced it to audiences primed by Vietnam to appreciate its anti-authoritarian message. Modern viewers recognize Paths of Glory as Kubrick's most politically engaged film, but its distribution was limited for decades by government pressure and industry self-censorship. 6. Nashville, 1975. Robert Altman's sprawling American epic uses country music as a backdrop for political assassination, creating a film so subversive that Paramount executives tried to bury it, despite critical acclaim. The film follows 24 characters over 5 days in Nashville, building to a shocking climax that parallels the political violence of the 1960s, while predicting the celebrity culture that would dominate later decades. What makes this film politically dangerous is Altman's portrayal of American society as fundamentally corrupt, with every character representing a different form of moral compromise or spiritual emptiness. The film's $2.2 million budget was stretched through innovative casting and location shooting that captured authentic Nashville atmosphere. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, but Paramount executives were horrified by its political implications and limited distribution despite Oscar nominations. The film's most controversial element was its suggestion that American political violence stems from celebrity culture and media manipulation, rather than foreign influence or individual madness. Altman's improvisational style creates a sense of documentary authenticity that makes the film's political critique more powerful and disturbing. The assassination sequence that climaxes the film was considered so inflammatory that some theaters refused to show it during a period of ongoing political violence. Box office was modest, despite critical acclaim, partly because audiences struggled with a film that offered no clear protagonist or moral center. The film's influence on later ensemble dramas and political films is immeasurable, but its distribution was limited by nervous distributors. Modern audiences recognize Nashville as one of the most prescient political films ever made, anticipating everything from reality television to political assassination as entertainment. 5. The Parallax View, 1974. Alan J. Pakula's paranoid thriller follows a journalist investigating political assassination, creating such a convincing portrait of institutional conspiracy that government officials pressured distributors to limit its release. Warren Beatty stars as a reporter who uncovers a shadowy organization that recruits and trains political assassins, only to become their next target. What makes this film terrifying is Pakula's suggestion that American political violence isn't random, but systematically organized by powerful interests that operate beyond democratic oversight. The film's $4 million budget allowed for spectacular set pieces, including an assassination sequence at the Seattle Space Needle that rivals anything in Hitchcock's catalog. Critics praised the film's technical mastery and political courage, but distributors grew nervous as the Watergate scandal made audiences more receptive to conspiracy theories. The film's most disturbing sequence involves the protagonist undergoing psychological testing to join the assassination organization, suggesting that political violence is a form of corporate recruitment. Government officials reportedly pressured theater chains to limit bookings, leading to restricted distribution despite strong reviews and box office performance. The film's influence on later conspiracy thrillers is clear, but its political implications made it a target for unofficial censorship. Pakula's direction creates an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia that makes every institution seem potentially corrupt or compromised. The film's ending, where the protagonist becomes another lone gunman, anticipates decades of conspiracy theories about political assassination. Modern audiences recognize The Parallax View as one of the most politically sophisticated thrillers ever made, but its distribution was limited by unofficial government pressure. The film's portrayal of systemic political corruption was considered too dangerous for wide release during a period of ongoing political crisis. 4. All the President's Men, 1976. Alan J. Pakula's Watergate thriller faced constant pressure from government officials and studio executives who feared its impact on American faith in democratic institutions. Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman play Washington Post reporters Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein as they uncover the conspiracy that brought down a president. What makes this film politically explosive is its portrayal of American government as fundamentally corrupt, with democratic institutions serving as a facade for criminal behavior at the highest levels. The film's $8.5 million budget allowed for meticulous recreation of Washington Post newsrooms and authentic government locations. Critics universally praised the film's authenticity and performances, but Warner Brothers executives worried about its impact on American political stability during an ongoing constitutional crisis. The film's most controversial element was its suggestion that the Watergate break-in was part of a larger pattern of government criminality rather than an isolated incident. Government officials reportedly tried to pressure the studio to delay release until after the 1976 election, leading to heated negotiations about the film's political timing. The film's influence on political journalism and conspiracy thrillers is immeasurable, but its production faced constant interference from nervous executives. Pakula's direction creates a documentary-style authenticity that makes the conspiracy more believable and disturbing than traditional thriller mechanics. The film's portrayal of journalism as a heroic profession came at a time when media credibility was under attack from all political sides. Box office success proved that audiences were hungry for honest examinations of political corruption, but the film's political implications made it a target for conservative criticism. Modern audiences recognize All the President's Men as one of the most important political films ever made. but its production and distribution faced unprecedented government and industry pressure. Third apocalypse. Now, 1979. Francis Ford Coppola's Vietnam epic faced rejection from every major studio before United Artists agreed to limited funding, forcing Coppola to mortgage his personal assets to complete the most expensive independent film ever made. Martin Sheen and Marlon Brando star in this adaptation of Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, transposed to Vietnam to explore American imperialism and moral corruption. What makes this film dangerous is Coppola's portrayal of the Vietnam War as a manifestation of deeper American violence and racism, rather than a noble cause corrupted by poor execution. The film's $31 million budget spiraled out of control during 238 days of chaotic shooting in the Philippines, where typhoons, heart attacks, and nervous breakdowns became part of the production legend. Critics were initially divided by the film's surreal approach to war, but its reputation has grown to legendary status as audiences recognized its psychological complexity. The film's most controversial element was its suggestion that American soldiers were as capable of savagery as their enemies, undermining traditional narratives about American moral superiority. Studios rejected the project for years, considering it unpatriotic and potentially damaging to American foreign policy during ongoing Cold War tensions. The production became a media circus as reports of chaos and excess made Coppola a symbol of Hollywood's disconnection from reality. Coppola's direction creates a hallucinogenic vision of war that captures the psychological disorientation of Vietnam better than any realistic approach. The film's influence on later war movies and political cinema is immeasurable, but its production nearly bankrupted its director and destroyed several careers. Modern audiences recognize Apocalypse Now as one of the greatest American films ever made, but its creation required fighting an industry that considered its political message too dangerous for mainstream release. 2. The Conversation, 1974. Francis Ford Coppola's paranoid masterpiece about government surveillance premiered during the Watergate crisis and was immediately targeted by nervous studio executives who feared its political implications. Gene Hackman stars as a professional surveillance expert who becomes the target of his own techniques after recording a conversation that reveals a murder plot. What makes this film politically explosive is its portrayal of privacy invasion as routine government and corporate practice rather than exceptional abuse of power. The film's $1.6 million budget forced creative solutions that enhanced its claustrophobic atmosphere, with most action taking place in cramped apartments and surveillance vans. Critics hailed it as a masterpiece, but Paramount executives grew increasingly nervous as the film's themes paralleled ongoing revelations about government surveillance programs. The film's most disturbing element was its suggestion that surveillance technology makes privacy impossible and democracy meaningless. Themes that seemed like science fiction in 1974 but proved prophetic. The film's release was delayed several times as studio executives debated whether its political implications were too dangerous during a period of ongoing constitutional crisis. Coppola's direction creates an atmosphere of pervasive paranoia that makes every phone call and conversation seem potentially monitored and recorded. The film's influence on later thrillers and surveillance cinema is clear, but its distribution was limited by nervous executives who feared government retaliation. The film's ending, where the protagonist tears apart his own apartment, searching for surveillance devices, became a metaphor for American democratic paranoia. Box office was modest despite critical acclaim, partly because audiences found its themes too disturbing during a period of ongoing political upheaval. Modern audiences recognize The Conversation as one of the most prescient political films ever made, anticipating digital surveillance culture by decades, but its initial distribution was severely limited by industry self-censorship. 1. Johnny Got His Gun, 1971. Dalton Trumbo's directorial debut, adapted from his own anti-war novel, was so politically dangerous that the film was effectively buried, despite winning major awards at Cannes. Timothy Bottom stars as a World War I soldier who loses his arms, legs, and face to an artillery shell, but retains his consciousness, becoming a living symbol of war's horror. What makes this film the most buried war movie of the decade is its unflinching portrayal of war as meaningless slaughter that destroys young men for the profit and glory of old men who never face the consequences. The film's $750,000 budget was raised independently after every major studio rejected Trumbo's pitch, considering the project too politically inflammatory for mainstream release. Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10 blacklisted during the McCarthy era, poured decades of political rage into creating the most devastating anti-war statement ever filmed. The film's structure, alternating between the protagonist's hospital reality and his memories of better times, creates an emotional experience so intense that many theaters warned audiences about its content. Critics at Cannes recognized the film's power, awarding it the Grand Prix and International Critics Prize, but American distributors struggled to find theaters willing to book such controversial material. The film's most powerful sequence shows the protagonist attempting to communicate through Morse code, tapping out his desire to be displayed as a warning about war's true cost. Military officials reportedly pressured distributors to limit release, considering the film dangerous to military recruitment and national morale during ongoing Vietnam conflict. The film disappeared from theaters quickly, despite critical acclaim, becoming an underground sensation through college screenings and anti-war protests. Trumbo's direction creates an experience so emotionally devastating that it transcends traditional anti-war cinema to become something approaching religious experience. The film's influence on later anti-war culture was enormous, but its distribution was severely limited by industry blacklisting and government pressure. Modern audiences know the film primarily through Metallica's One music video, but its power as political cinema remains undiminished for decades. Which of these buried masterpieces shocked you the most? Did we miss any 1970s war films that deserve to be rescued from Hollywood's memory hole? And here's the big question that'll start a war in the comments. Were studios right to bury these films to protect national morale? Or does cinema have a responsibility to tell uncomfortable truths even when they undermine official narratives? Sound off below, because the best art has always been dangerous to those in power.